When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Political conversations about democracy can often take place at too high a level. People talk about freedom of expression and deliberation, the will of the governed. But what makes democracy tick isn't just high ideals. It's whether people can actually talk and listen and argue with one another. The public sphere is a space where individuals can gather to discuss issues of shared concern, hopefully free from coercion, and they have universal access to this sphere. This all sounds good, right? But what does that look like in practice? Well, let's bring it down to something relatable: family arguments. Imagine a family deciding where to go on vacation. Everyone has opinions. Your sister wants to go to the beach. Your dad wants to go to the mountains. Your mom is lobbying for a trip to a famous city. If the decision-making is fair, everyone gets a say, reasons are exchanged. Hopefully the force of the better argument wins out. Maybe your dad convinces everyone that the mountain cabin will be more relaxing and cheaper. And if your sister's voice isn't heard, though, because she's constantly interrupted, that's unfair. Or if the father holds the wallet, so his preference wins regardless for how good his arguments are, also quite unfair. Suddenly, it's not a true deliberation, it's just the performance of one, the theater of democracy. The public sphere works best when no one is systematically excluded and arguments are judged on their merits. And this concept, of course, doesn't just apply to family trips. Talking and hearing is the whole business of democracy. It's how we discuss politics and culture and social issues. If only the loudest voices or the wealthiest interests get heard, the public discourse is skewed. An open public sphere asks us all to take a look not just at free expression, but freedom of access. A healthy public sphere isn't just a theoretical idea, it's a practice we live every day. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest on When We Disagree is Ben Klutze. Ben is the Executive Director of the Mercatus Center, which advances knowledge about markets and human freedom. Ben's work to encourage free dialogue across our differences is showcased in the documentary Undivide Us. Ben, tell us an argument story.
Well, this one goes way, 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 way back when I was about 11 years old. For the very first time, I had landed on a different continent. I grew up in Ghana, West Africa. And so for most of my childhood, that's all I knew. But my family and I went on a vacation to Germany, and we went to a town called Emden. It's in the northern part of Germany, right at the Dutch-German border. And on the very first day we arrived, my three siblings and I saw that there was a playground across the street from where we stayed. And we were excited because we heard these kids jumping around and screaming and just really excited. And we saw all the things that kids will be excited about, the seesaws, the swings, and so on. And so, we just put on our shoes and we ran outside. And just about 6 feet before the edge of the playground, the kids just stopped. The kids who were jumping around and screaming and seemed excited just stopped. And they were yelling and screaming. They were actually crying. And they were pointing at us and yelling the N-word. And that was quite an experience. My brother and my two sisters, we were just shocked, because we'd never experienced anything like that before. Their parents, was mostly their moms, came and basically whisked them away, as they were crying and sobbing, and they just took them away as though they were trying to shield them from people like us.
Wow.
And we did not end up playing at all. We just went back because it seemed to us that it was not a friendly environment. And that's something that has stayed with me a very long time. Sometimes I think about it, I'm not sure what their preconceived notions of people with dark skins were. And it might have been the case that they'd never seen anyone like us before, or that they had heard about people like us and they were terrified of us, and that they had heard that people like us were extremely awful and that they had to stay away from us. Whatever it was, I'm not sure. And oftentimes I wish I could go back and have a conversation with them
Yeah.
and ask them why.
It sounds like you have some lingering, I mean, it's obviously an emotionally powerful experience
Mhm,
and some lingering confusion about what was
mhm.
really happening in that exchange.
Right,
How did
right.
you feel? Let's go through it chronologically.
Mhm,
You've talked a little bit about not wanting to play at this empty, uninviting playground after these children were whisked away after
mhm.
saying what they said. How did you
Right.
feel in the moments, both in the immediate moment and then in the days that passed?
It was just a sense that um, we were not completely welcome, right? That you got to be sure you don't uh, you got to be careful at every turn, every step of the way, because the people here may not all really want you here. Um, and that was a disconcerting feeling.
Did you
Yeah.
speak back, you or your
No,
siblings?
my aunt, who was with us at the time, she spoke fluent German. And so she exchanged some words with the parents, and there was some yelling involved, but I didn't understand any of it. It was all in German.
Huh.
I didn't understand any of it, but my aunt seemed upset that that had happened. And
Right.
uh, yeah,
And
yeah,
you could interpret through the tones, I presume, even though it was in German, that
right,
something was going on.
right.
And they said the
In
word
fact,
in English. Is that right?
it was a word. It was an English. I mean, I know the word,
Right.
but I haven't. I need to do some research on whether that's the same thing in German or it means
Right.
something else in German. But whatever it meant, it just seemed hostile.
It has an international hostility currency,
Right.
even if it's Ghanaians in a
Yeah.
northern German playground. Whenever this
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
everybody was on the level about what we were talking about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as you go, let's talk about whether you had experienced this kind of, as you put it, unwelcomeness or hostility before or since, because you were in Ghana at the time,
Mhm,
traveling to
mhm,
Germany, experiencing hostility, unexpected. It sounds like are now
mhm,
and have been in the States for quite some time.
mhm,
Any
mhm.
corollaries in life whatsoever?
No, so you fast forward about 7 years later, and I come to college in the US. That was, the next time I'm in a different continent. And, I land in Appleton, Wisconsin. I often say that was my introduction to America.
There's no
And
better place.
yeah, and I did not know what to expect. I really did not know what to expect given what I had seen in Germany. And I'd watched movies like Roots. I had a sense of the struggles with civil rights in the US. Um, so I really was uncertain. But I have to say, Appleton, Wisconsin was the most welcoming place. I I towards the end of my senior year, when I was about to graduate, I remember getting very emotional about leaving college because it was an amazing bubble.
Mm,
Just people treating me with such kindness from campus to sort of the town folks who would say hi to you on the streets and have a conversation with you, and it was a quite a an experience. And since then, I've really never experienced anything like I experienced in Germany ever before.
and the experience in Germany, it obviously lives large in your memory and your emotional experience of it, but it didn't totally color your expectations of what life would be like on the ground when you got to the States. Certainly in there, but not, you weren't bracing, thinking, okay, this is going to happen again.
Right, right. I wasn't. I mean, I really just kept an open mind. And I was open to being proven, one way or the other. And yeah, it's been quite an interesting experience. I mean, as you know, recently, before I became executive director of the Mercator Center, I ran our program on pluralism and civil exchange. And I think that my interest in pluralism probably began there, trying to understand how we can live together and coexist amidst deep divides and differences.
Would you define pluralism for us briefly?
Sure. I think there are two ways of thinking about pluralism. One is just the fact of difference, the fact of diversity in a place.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes a little beyond that, which is about integration and engagement with that difference. So a truly pluralistic society is one where I think diverse people from different backgrounds are actually interacting and engage with all kinds of, in practices and conversations to sort of enrich that diverse experience. And so you could have a very diverse society that is not fully pluralistic because they're not truly engaging with each other, if that
An
makes sense.
extreme example of that would be apartheid South Africa, diverse society, certainly not engaging in.
Exactly. Exactly.
And just
Yep.
to link this conceptually back to your experience as a young guy in Germany, it sounds at least if I'm understanding this definition correctly, that in the moment these Germans on the playground were confronted with diversity, with visual diversity.
Right.
These people look different than we do. And then secondarily, we don't want to engage. And so we scream and then are whisked away. So it's both a denial of and an engagement, refusal to engage.
Exactly. Exactly. And it wasn't as though we had said anything. It wasn't as though we had done anything. I mean, we just walked towards the playground.
You just were.
So it's hard to kind of justify that, it might have been something that we had done or said.
There's so much of a sense of when we look at our lives, especially with a little bit of age, and look back and say, do you make sense of your life as a straight line? Or are you telling yourself a kind of fiction that this all made sense or it was all kind of random? And I'm saying that just to build up to this question, which is, can you draw a straight line between this really standout, powerful event in Germany and you dedicating your life to pluralism?
I think it can. I think so because I've asked my siblings about this experience because they were all there, but for some reason I seem to remember it more strongly than they do. They remember it, but it's more vague, I guess, in their memories. And for me, it's still very, very strongly there.
Yeah.
So
And if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it also sounds a little bit like when you got to college from Ghana in Appleton, Wisconsin, that you were pretty predisposed towards kind of a pluralistic engagement with folks in Appleton. In other words, your idea was, yes, I've seen roots. Yes, this thing would happen on the playground in Germany. And, I'm excited to meet new people. And you called it an amazing bubble.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I say bubble because I understand that the United States is a really, really big country and that my experience, it might be different from other people's experiences.
What do you see as the biggest threats to pluralism today, both interpersonally, politically, economically? What concerns you?
Oftentimes when people ask me about what concerns me, I often say apathy.
Mm.
We could take things for granted, and I don't want us to take things for granted. I want us to really ask ourselves a number of questions about how much better this could be, how much better a truly pluralistic society could be. And I think America does well. We're not perfect. I think, to we oftentimes people call Americans, sort of call America the melting pot. And I think that that is true, although that's being challenged, right? I mean, we have lots of challenges to um, this country that is full of immigrants. Um, but as Yasha Monk will say, for the very first time, we're seeing large, growing, multi-ethnic, multiracial democracies, which the world has not really experienced historically. And this is happening across, Europe and the United States. And so we are being nudged to truly engage. I think so. I don't want us to be apathetic about the fact of difference. I want us to be thoughtful about how we engage the differences. That's number one.
Hmm.
Number two, the threat will be, I'm a big fan of John Inazu, who wrote the book called Confident Pluralism. And John says that there are two important features about pluralism. The first is inclusion, that as a society becomes more and more morally enlightened, we begin to include more people who have been marginalized from society. And that's a good thing.
Hmm.
But there's another feature of pluralism that is about dissent and disagreement. And we have things like the freedom of assembly, the right to protest, and all these things that allow us to dissent and disagree from, orthodoxies, current practices, what have you. And from time to time, you'll notice that inclusion and dissent are in tension. And truly, I think pluralistic society is one that is able to sustain these tensions over longer periods of time. And it's not easy, it's difficult, but I think we have to try. And so that's one thing I worry about, just not being able to grapple with the tensions that pluralism comes with.
Well said. And just to kind of go right at one of those tensions and take it from a German playground to a kind of population level, you noted from this book, Confident Pluralism, that it really includes two values that can be seen as being in conflict.
Right.
Inclusion, which sounds a bit to me like the philosophical concept of the expanding circle. The more morally enlightened we become, the more we care about this group of people and that group of people and find their moral agency of children, of prisoners, and then all the way to animals and inanimate objects and all of these sorts of things. And then also dissent, that reasonable minds are going to disagree and great minds don't always think alike, is the phrase.
Yep.
And so with those ideas of how do we include those who are exclusive, in other words, liberalism with a small L can be threatened by illiberalism, but if we're dedicated to inclusion, how do we bring the folks in whose fundamental ideas are exclusive, if not eliminationist? And then second, how do we tolerate dissent like that which you experience on the playground that seeks to also eliminate and deny?
That's a great question and a hard one.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'd say is that, when we run our Pluralist Lab events, we have these events called the Pluralist Lab. We bring students from across backgrounds and differences together. We kind of walk through a set of principles, which I think are relevant principles for us to think about in our everyday lives, especially when we're dealing with the question of pluralism. The first is respect, and the idea is that we are one another's dignified equals. A democracy is a society of self-governing equals, and you have as much right to be here as I do. And so if we're going to share space, we're going to have to learn to respect one another. And the second principle is authenticity, and that if we truly respect one another, we have to come to the table. We have to engage with authenticity. We're not masking our views or pretending to be something we're not, but we are being as real as possible. And then finally, curiosity, that we have to be able to ask questions. And, someone's views might be extremely antithetical to yours. They can be exclusionary, but there is some value in asking questions. And it reminds me of Daryl Davis, an amazing jazz musician, African-American jazz musician, who has talked to many, 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 many members of the Ku Klux Klan who have eventually derobed because he engaged them with curiosity. Now, not everyone can be Daryl Davis, but I think that there are lessons from Daryl Davis's experience that I think is worth internalizing. That if we engage with respect, with authenticity, and with curiosity, it will take us a long way. I'll also highlight three things that John and Ozzy would call civic aspirations. The first is toleration, comes from the Latin word tolere, which means to endure. So there is a certain kind of enduring that has to happen, when we live in a very, very diverse society. It's inevitable. Um, the second is humility, the idea that you may not be able to convince someone of your views, and that's okay, and then finally patience, that a lot of this stuff just takes a long time, and it's uncomfortable.
Right.
It can be challenging, it can be painful, but with time, I think we do get better at this. And I think we oftentimes forget that the patience bit, because some of us with a more activist, personalities and activist ethos want to change now. But I think that long-lasting change also takes a while to happen.
Well said. And I really appreciate you distilling those principles as well as telling the story of Daryl Davis. One of the things that Davis mentions, and he's certainly a powerful influence on the work that I do in this podcast as well, as we encounter difference and talk about reasonable disagreement and what are the limits of persuasion. One of the things he says that stands out to me a lot is that if folks aren't engaged in the process as you defined it of respect, authenticity, curiosity, endurance, humility, patience, etc., that there's really not any bridges to be built there if there's no mutual commitment there. And he also says that ignorance can be cured, but malice and stupidity cannot. So
Right.
there is a kind of limit there. And in fanning out at a population level, what do you think about illiberal restrictions that are meant to promote inclusion? For instance, going back to the Germany example, bans on public flying of Nazi flags, of displays of swastikas, of policing the public sphere from potentially poisonous, discriminatory symbols.
That's a great question. I mean, I'm I don't know that I'll call myself a free speech absolutionist, but I'm very much pro free speech. But I also recognize that societies have to make these decisions on their own, given the struggles that they have experienced. And so it's all context specific. And Germany has gone through some incredibly devastating periods throughout their history that I can understand, why they would decide to do those types of things. I think that we can't make these restrictions across the board or declarations across the board. It will have to be country specific. I respect that.
And in a general sense, you'd support the answer to free speech is often more free speech, and that there can be artistic, social, and contextual judgments made as we apply that principle.
Absolutely.
Ben Klutze, thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.